Hello, this is Randy with Excel for Freelancers, and welcome to the Ultimate Accounts Receivable Manager. In this training, we're going to go over everything about receivables, including a complete dashboard, aging summary, aging detail, complete drill down on charts. We're also going to go over payments, customer payments, and how we track those, invoicing, and a whole lot more. It's going to be an incredible training. I hope you'll stick with us. Let's get started. All right, thanks so much for the Accounts Receivable Manager. This training is all about accounts receivable. How do we bill for invoicing? How do we accept payments? How do we track those payments? Are the payments late? How do we track late payments and go over that? And also, how do we create this really cool dashboard with automatic drill down so we can drill down into any and get a report on that? We're going to go over that along with an aging summary complete with detail along with that and the ability to select an invoice and go directly to that invoice. We're also going to be covering up this invoice along with the ability to add customer payments, new payments, saving payments, deleted, navigating through previous and next payments. So we've got all that to cover. So I'm really excited about this particular training because it is brand new and I've got so much to show you on this. So we're going to get started. Before we do though, I just want to check a few things. Make sure that you're subscribed to this channel. All you need to do is click the subscription button along with the notification icon bell. That'll ensure that you get these trainings each and every week direct to you. If you like this workbook, it's absolutely free. All you need to do is click the links down in the description, either with your email or Facebook Messenger, and we're going to get that sent over right to you. All these trainings are absolutely free. However, if you do like to support us in this channel and all these trainings, there are some fantastic ways to do that. The first is I've got an incredible 200 workbook template, and that means every single one of my best templates, 200 of them, into a single zip file, and that comes with an incredible library. So you can single click to go to the training and a single click to open up the workbook, having your entire library right there in front of you. And available now as an option, the PDF codebooks, and that means detailed, organized, color-coded PDF codebooks that you can download for every single workbook inside that pack. That's an option, and that's going to allow you to highlight, single click to go to an index or a table of contents. We've got all that inside these PDF codebooks. I'll include the link down below. That's the 200 zip file with optional PDF codebooks. All right, let's get started on this training. First, an overview, and then we're going to go into detail. I'm going to go over every line of code, when it applies to this accounts receivable, and how you can create your own accounts receivable, and how you can set up an incredible workbook to do all that, whether it's track invoices, track payments, track accounts receivable, and a whole lot more, along with this really cool horizontal tab feature, which we're going to get to. And of course, in an aging detail, we're going to be able to drill down into current balances, or we're going to track down to 31, and we're also, of course, going to have the ability to select on those current, and it's also going to take us to the current balances. Or if we go select and we want to see the older balances, we're going to be able to do that. So I'm going to show you how you can drill down into this aging summary and of course put this dashboard together. All right, but everything starts with an invoice, right? Everything starts with an invoice. Now we did this invoice, and I've got a training called Invoice with Profit. If you want to see how we created this invoice called Invoice with Profit, I'll include the link down below so you can follow everything on how to create an invoice. Since we're focused on the payments and receivable area, we're not going to go over this invoice too much. However, there's a few essential things that we did update on this invoice, and there's a few essential things that you'll want to make sure when you have on your invoice in order to track payments and track collections properly, along with aging and receivables. So that's very, very important. All right, so the components that you need on your invoice, certainly you need a customer, right? You need an invoice date. A status is extremely helpful, but not required. The terms, right? So we've got terms. What are the terms? And a due on date. What is the date of the due? Now, we have an admin screen here that's going to track some of those things. We've got status. Right now, we've got open, set, paid, partially paid, and billed, unpaid. And we've also got a default. And what that means is when you create a brand new invoice, what do you want that status to default to? And also we have payment terms. What are the payment terms of your invoices? Certain customers can have certain payments. Certain invoice types can have certain payments. Sometimes they're due on a receipt. Sometimes you'll give the customer 30 or 60 days to pay their bill. So we can set up additional terms here, simply putting in the number of days and then setting a default on new invoices. What is your default term? So if we set a status to open and we set a default term to net 15, we then can go into the invoice and create a brand new invoice. And we see quickly that the status is set to open and the terms are set to net 15. If we were to change that to unpaid and net 30, and we create a brand new invoice, just clicking the new invoice, and we'll see that that is now unpaid and net 30. So we want to be able to set the default terms. That makes it a lot easier. Another thing that we want to do is we want to automate the due on date, right? We want the invoice date is the current date, which is April 8th here. We want to automate the due on date, and that's going to be based on the terms. So if I were to reset those terms to net 15, I want that due on date to change automatically to the 23rd. Likewise, if I were to change this date here, let's say to the 18th, I also want the due on date to change based on those terms. So we're going to focus on changes either to the invoice date or either to the terms. In either one of those instances, we want the due on date to change. So we certainly need to set up a proper table inside our admin based on the number of days. Notice the due on date has 0 days, 15 days number, so we have the number of days selected. So we're going to start right there with this training. How do we automate that process and how do we do that? Okay, so the first thing which you saw was the selection change event, meaning when I make a selection change, I want that default checkbox to set in that cell. It's the same thing here. So how do we do that? Well, certainly we need to know the cell that we've selected, and we want to make sure we clear everything else out and then put a checkbox inside that cell. Now, if we want to know what that checkbox is, we're going to use a character equivalent of that. So when we do insert and we click a symbol, and let's say we want a symbol here, we want to do a checkbox. So this checkbox I have here, right here, so we can see that, and it's this checkbox right here, and we see that that's character code 252. If I click that, character code 252. So how do we get that? So we can use the equivalent inside VBA as well. So we're going to do that. Let's go into VBA and start with this admin to see how we get these default checkboxes set up very, very easily. So we're going to go into the developer and Visual Basic here. If you don't have the developers tab open, all you need to do is just go into the options and then go into the advanced and then scroll down here, and then go into the customize ribbon here and then just make sure that the developer is selected there. Make sure that that option is selected. Likewise, you can use a shortcut. Alt F11 will get you there. Alt F11 will get you into the VBA. We're going to be focused on just the admin screen, because we're focused on the selection change event based on that. So it's worksheet selection change event. We can get that right here. Now, of course, if they select more than one cell, we're going to exit the sub. However, if they make a selection between D6 and D12, we want something to happen, right? So if we see here D6 to D12, we want something to happen. Well, what do we want to happen? Well, what I want to happen is I first want to clear out all the cells, and I want to make sure that there's no value. I want to make sure that C contains a value, because if they set either one of these defaults, we don't want anything to happen only when there's an actual value in here. So how are we going to do that? Making sure that C contains a value. So we want to make sure that C and the target value doesn't equal empty, right? C needs to contain a value. Once we have that, what I want to do is then clear all of the contents of all the cells, all the way from D6 to D12. Then what I want to do is I want to set that target value to that character equivalent. That checkbox is character 252. Then all I'm going to do is just select another cell. That means unselected, and that allows them to double click on a single cell, selecting or unselecting it very, very easily, right? Like that. So that's how we do that. And we're going to do the exact same for this range here. So all the way from H6 to H23, we're going to do exactly the same thing, and that's going to be on the payment term selecting, setting that default, H6 to H23. And also we want to make sure that F contains a value, which is correct. We want F to contain a value because we need to make sure that we have a term name associated with that. We're going to clear all the contents out. We're going to set that checkbox, and then we're going to select another cell. That's all we have to do to set the defaults. Great. So now we understand how we get those, but how do we get them to automate in this invoice screen? Now, there's a lot of features of the invoice. This particular training is focused on receivables. So we're not going to go how to save an invoice. That's already been done. And of course, you can refer back to the Invoice with Profit training where we create this invoice. This week, I'm just going to focus on automating these and getting the exact right data inside our invoice list. All this invoice data is saved inside our invoice list right here. So if we take a look inside the invoice list, we've got some additional information. We've got invoice date, customer date, the status. I want to save the terms. I want to know the due date, the total, and then we have some calculated fields here: total paid, balance, and days overdue. Okay, so we've got all that we'll be going over as we go into that. But first, let's focus on how we automate that due date. That's very, very important, right? We want to make sure it's much easier. We don't want users to have to enter the due date. If they enter the terms, we want to make sure that that due date gets automated automatically. And so how do we do that? Well, it's going to be on a change event, right? When a user makes a change either to I3 or they make a change to, of course, I5, right? Either one of those. However, there's different types of changes. When an invoice gets loaded, if I were to load an invoice up by searching it here, that's also a kind of change. But I don't want to change that due on date. I don't want to change it based on when we make the change, when it's loading up. When that data loads in, that's also a change. So there's two different types of changes. One where the user makes a change, and two when the information's loading up. So I need to differentiate between those two changes. And so how do I do it? Well, I'm going to set one cell. When it's being loaded up, I'm going to set cell B6 to true. So when it's loading, B6 will go to true. When it's finished loading, B6 will go to false. So what I'm going to do is check when a change is made here to either the invoice date or either the terms. I want to know if B6 is true. If it is true, that means the invoice is loading from a previously saved invoice, and in that case, we do not want to make those changes. However, if B6 is false, then we do want to make changes to the due on date based both on the terms and based both on the invoice date. Okay, so that's going to be the change event. We're going to focus on both again, I3 and I5. So let's go back into the developer, and we're going to go back into this time the invoice screen. So I'm going to select on the invoice screen here, and we're focused on worksheet change events, right? We're making a change. So how are we going to do that? This is for customer change, right? This is for invoice search when we search for another invoice, and this is for invoice date or terms, but not on invoice load. So this is the one I want to focus on with you now. If we make a change to I5 or I3 and B6 is false, meaning the invoice is not loading just very, very quickly, when we go into the invoice macros and we go into the macro that's going to load that invoice right here, here's the invoice load. When we load it, we are going to set B6 to true. If we see B6 goes to true, before it ends, it goes back to false. So that means when those kind of changes to the invoice date or the terms, when those changes are being made, we don't want to automate anything. Great. So back now inside the invoice. So when we make a change to that, what do I want to do? I want to check to make sure that both we have a term and we also have an invoice date. I want to make sure that both I3 and both I5 contain values. If they don't, then we're going to exit the sub. So here, if I3 equals empty or I5 equals empty, then exit the sub. Exit on either invoice date or terms being blank, we're going to exit out. If neither one of them are blank, then we continue on. I'm going to dimension the payment term as a string and also the payment row as a long. I need to find that payment, and I need to know what? Why is that important? When I look for that payment term here, I need to know where is it found. Once it's found, I know what row it's on, and I need to extract the number of days in column G because I need to know how many days to increase based on the invoice date. I need to calculate that due date. So that's just what we're going to do. We're going to define the payment term. It's going to be based on whatever is in I5 on that invoice, right? So we're going to put that into a variable, that payment term right here in I5. And then next up, what we're going to do is I'm going to look for the row. Where is it found on the admin screen? I've got a named range for all those terms called terms, for all those payment terms. If we look into the formulas, name manager, and I go to terms, you're going to see that we have that offset named range based on that. So it means all the terms are going to be in that named range called terms. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look inside the named range called terms, and I'm going to look to see what row that term is found on. But if it's not found, it could create an error. Therefore, we have to wrap it in on error resume next and on error go to 0. So what we're going to do is we're going to look for that, and if it's found, I'm going to put it into this payment row variable. So we're going to search. We're going to look for, using the admin, searching in this named range. We're going to use the find function, and we're going to look for that payment term in the Excel values in Excel whole. And what I want to do is I want to extract the row out of it. Then all I need to do is just run a check. if that payment row that's been found, if it's not 0, that means it has been found, then all we're going to do is we're going to set that due date. And what's that due date going to be? That due date is going to be based on the invoice date plus whatever number of days that we've found here, plus 0, plus 15, 30, or 60. So that's all we need to do inside the code. I6, the due date, equals I3, the invoice date, plus the number of days that were found, and that's going to set us our due date. That's very, very easy. Okay, great. So once we have the due date, right, when we save that invoice, we want to then make sure that that gets saved. So let's take a quick look in the invoice, right? Invoice on that save macro. We've been over these macros before, but I've got an exclusive training just on this, right? All I want to do is make sure that we assign a row to that invoice inside that database here, setting that invoice row here, getting that row, and making sure that the due date, the total, and all this information. Now, this information is calculated, so we don't have to worry about that just yet. I'll go over that very soon. But all we're doing is saving it up to G, making sure that all that's the status, terms, due date, and everything got done. Okay, great. So we understand that the terms, of course, status D, terms gets saved in column E, due date, and then, of course, the invoice total gets saved. So all that's going to be saved on our invoice list. Once we have all that data, we can then calculate it, right? I know it. And then I want to determine how many were paid. What is the total paid, right? I want to know what was paid. So we're going to go over that. That's going to be based on some payments. So next up, we know how we create payments. And now what I see a lot of people do, which is probably incorrect, is they'll put another column here called payment column. And that assumes that the customer's only going to make one payment. And if you're in your business or the business the customer only makes one payment, they don't make multiple payments, or they never pay half or a percentage, then probably it's okay to put in a single column and put the amount paid. However, in most businesses, customers can make multiple payments for one invoice. They may not pay at all. Therefore, you would want an invoice screen. So if I decide I want to enter a payment for an invoice, I can do this. I can enter the payment, right? I can add a new payment if I want. And I can enter the invoice number here. And I see that the payment amount, the invoice balance is $4. So maybe I just want to pay $2 of that. And we have a $2 balance. So $2 payment. We can just put $2 payment. Okay, so that way it allows multiple payments for the same payment. If I save it, we're going to see the history show up right here. Now we have the full history of all the payments for that customer. We see on this customer payment history, they've paid just invoice number 5, they paid $190 on the 7th, and then another, and then another. So they have multiple payments, okay? So there's lots of options here that we can do. So giving that, once we have that, what we can do is we can put all this payment information into another table. And that's exactly what we have inside the payment database here. Here we can track all the payments. We have a unique payment ID. We have the date of the payment. We have the customer. We have the invoice number that they paid, the payment amount, and the notes. So we can put all that into a table. Once we can track that, it's much easier. So let's do that one more time. Let's add a new payment here. I'm going to default this to the current date. Right? I think I need to update that. And then what we want to do is enter that payment here. So we can scroll down, enter payment number 8. We see the invoice amount is 10. Previous payments are 0. So we can pay for the full balance here by entering that. We see the invoice balance and then the test notes. Great. So now we have that. And all we need to do is just save that payment. It's now going to be saved. And we see that we've got different payments. The same customer has previously, we've put invoice number 8, which they just paid. And then previously, they also paid for invoice number 2 of $21. So we can also have a payment history from the customer. All right, so let's take a deeper look into this screen. I've got 2 columns that we're going to use for admin. And we're going to track something. Now, I want to know what selected payment ID. What is that payment ID? If we take a look inside our payment database, every single payment has a unique ID. We want to track those. So I want to know, as we navigate back and forth, we see the payment ID changing. I also need to know the row associated with that ID. So we're going to use the match based on the named range called payment IDs. This is a dynamic named range based on all the payment IDs here. So I want to know what row is associated. Making sure that if I see payment ID 3, I want to use the match, and I want to know that that is on row 5. That's very important. I also want to get the next available payment ID number, right? So using again our named range payment ID, I'm going to use the max function. We're going to use the maximum of that, which is 8, plus 1, which will get us 9. Right? If there's no data at all, it could create an error. Therefore, we want to default it to 1. If there's no data or there's an error, it will default to 1. Okay, very good. I also want to know what row is associated with the invoice ID. Notice we've got an invoice number here. I want to make sure it is a correct invoice number, and I want to know the invoice ID that's associated, and I want to know the row that is associated with that. So that means that invoice number 4 is located on row number 6. If we take a look inside our invoice list, and we see that invoice ID 4 is located on row 6. So we want to know everything about that, and that's going to help us. What I also want to do is I also want to extract the customer row from that. That's very important. If I've got a customer invoice number and I want to extract the customer, I've got to know that. If we take a look inside our invoice list, we've got a customer here, and I've got a named range called invoice customer. If we look into the formulas, name manager, and we go to invoice, we see we've got invoice customer name. This is a dynamic name range based on all the customers on our invoice. What I want to do is I want to find that. I want to know what row. I want to determine what row the invoice ID is on. I want to extract the customer name from that. Then what I want to do is I want to determine what row inside the customer database. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that customer name. Then I'm going to use a match, and I'm going to use another name range called customer name. If we go back into the formulas and the name manager, we go into customer, we see that we have customer name. Okay, this is again dynamic. So I want to extract the row. The row is very important because I then want to put the address, city, state, zip, and I want to place that directly in the subsequent lines here along with the customer name. VBA is going to do that, but that row is going to be helpful. It's also going to let us know that we have a correct customer. So how do we get that row of that customer? Well, of course, we can use the index match in a few combinations. The first thing what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that invoice number here and I'm going to use a match. This is going to tell us what rows the invoice is on, just as we did before. Then what I want to do is I want to index the customer name of that invoice. Once I know the customer name and I know the row and I know that that's a column, then I've got the customer name. And here's where I've got the customer name right here. I'm going to take that customer name and I'm going to run a match using the match. I'm going to base it on all the customer names we have. I'm going to add 2 because I want to know what row that customer is on, right? Our customers start on row 3, so I'm going to add 2 because I need to know what row. And that's going to extract that row and it's going to place it directly inside here, B6. So that's all the components we have as far as the admin components on this. Let's get into VBA and take a look inside, and we're going to focus on our module here called our payment macros. And the first one we're going to focus on is the payment customer payments refresh. Now what that is basically going to refresh all the payments associated for that customer, regardless of invoice. So what I want to do is I want to run an advanced filter. I want to know what customer. VBA is going to take care of this. Let's take a quick look at this. How did we get this name? If we enter a new payment, as soon as I make a change to that, or as soon as I add an invoice number, that customer name is going to automate. That customer name is very important because it is that we're going to use the advanced filter, and then we're going to run the macro. As soon as we save it, it's going to automatically refresh. I could probably get it to run it automatically when I make the change. So let's do that. I'm going to actually do that because I want to know all the history as soon as I enter an invoice. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this macro here. We're going to go into the worksheet change event. So if we take a look inside the payments here, and we're focused on a worksheet change event. On the invoice number, add the customer details, right? So we want to add the customer details, and I also want to add the payments refresh, but I only want to make sure that I don't want to add this to make sure that we have an actual customer name, right? I want to make sure that D5 is not empty. So we're going to check to make sure that D5 is not empty. If range D5, its customer name value does not equal empty, then payment run the macro. Okay, so what are we going to do? Remember, we're focused on E3, right? When we make a change, let's clear that out. When I make a change to E3, that is when I want to notice we automatically had that payment history show up. So it's working great. That's what I wanted to happen. So that's when we want something to happen. But we certainly need to make sure that B6 contains a value, right? If there's an error, if it's not found, it's going to be empty. So B6 is critical for that. So we want to make sure that E3 does not equal empty, right? We want to make sure that there actually is an invoice number. If we clear the contents, this is also a change too, right? But that's not the kind of change that we want if I just delete it, right? I want the the kind of change that we're going to actually enter something in there. So that's the kind of change that we're focused on. So how do we do that? Well, we make sure that, of course, there's a value. Then what we're going to do is determine the customer row is long. And we will need to make sure the B6, which is our customer row, is not empty. If it's not empty, we can continue the following. Okay, the customer row is going to be based on B6. D5, that's the customer, that's what we're going to do. We're going to put the customer name, and that's going to come from our customers. Column B, right? We know that inside our customers, we've got the customer row. Column B, the next line is going to go to C, and then the D, E, and F are going to go into the remaining third line. And that's all we need to do here. D6 is simply equal to the address in column C here. D6 is simply equal to the address in column C. And then we have the remaining city, state, and zip here. So we're going to put in city, state, zip. Okay, so all those are going to come into D7. We're going to see that's going to come from columns D, E, and F. I'm going to put that. And then, of course, we are going to run, just to make sure, I'm going to put this in here just in case it's not found. I'm going to put that directly in here because I want to make sure that it's only when we found a customer are we then going to, but D5 covers it. We've covered it. Then we're going to automate this payment customer fetch. It is that macro that we're going to go over right now. That is the macro that we are going to use when we refresh all the data. The first thing we want to do when we run this macro is we want to clear out any existing payments in the screen. So inside our payment screen, starting all the way from D13 and moving all the way from H in the row down, we want to clear out the contents of everything there. Once we've done that, we can focus on the payments database because we're going to need to run an advanced filter. I want to know only payments made by this particular customer. And that's going to come from our payments database. This is where all of our payments are tracked. And what I want to do is I want to run an advanced filter. So all we need is some criteria, and that criteria is going to be based on the interpayment screen D5. That is our customer name. I'm going to run that advanced filter. I'm going to get those results and place them directly here. I'm going to bring those results directly in here. That's it. It is conditional formatting that's going to be doing that. So if we take a look inside the conditional formatting, we have alternating row colors based on the mod and making sure that column D contains a value. This is for odd rows and this is for even rows. So as soon as we delete the data, right, that conditional formatting goes back, and then we just simply add some text and we can easily see how we can have automatically the information show up. Okay, great. So we understand how to clear it, and now what we want to do is I want to run that advanced filter. To do that inside the payments database, I want to determine the last row. If it's less than 3, we're going to exit this up. We're going to then run our advanced filter. So we're going to take a look inside our payments database. We're going to run the row here from A2 all the way through F. The criteria is going to be from K1 through K2. And of course, our results are going to come in from M2 through P2. And that's just what we have on our advanced filter here, A2 through F. Our criteria is K1 through K2, and our results are M2 through P2. We're going to check to make sure that we have those results. Last results row from column M, making sure that it's not leveled. Then what I want to do is I want to sort the result based on dates. So I know that I want the highest date first. So if there's additional payments, Betty White, of course, has 2 payments. If we were to do her, we'd see that 8 on top. I want to do the newest payments on top and the oldest on the bottom. So to do that, we want to sort based on date, and I want to sort based on descending. If we have just one row of data, there's no reason to sort it, so we're going to check for that. If the last results are less than 4, meaning we have just one row of data, we're going to skip the sort, and it's going to go right down to here. However, if we have more than one row, we then want to run the sort. We're going to clear the sort field first. We're going to base it on M3. Make sure you call out the sheet again here and here because we're inside another width. M3, and of course we're sorting descending. We want the highest date, the latest date first, going down to the oldest date. We're going to run our range from M3 all the way through P. That is our payments database range. That's the range. And then we're going to apply that sort. Then all we need to do is bring over that sorted data D13 through G, and the last results row plus 10. Remember, our results start here in 3. Our results come here inside row 13. The difference is 10 rows, so we need to compensate by adding 10 here. That's it. That's going to bring all of the data. Very, very cool. All right, great. So that's how we load in information. But what about save it? If I want to save it, right, I want to make sure to add in some information. So notice that this one, and if it's missing any payment data, if we're missing a payment amount or missing a date, I want to let the user know that a payment amount and a payment date are both required. So that's going to be on the save and the update there. So with our payments, we're focused on that. If B5 equals empty, right, we don't have a correct invoice number. If I enter an incorrect invoice number here, we see that B5 would be empty. There's no invoice ID row here. So we need to let the user know the first thing we want to do is please select a correct invoice. If we can't, we have to apply those payments to a specific invoice. So without an invoice ID row here, we need to let the user know. So that's going to let us know right here. All right, then once we do, we can set that invoice row into a variable. And then I'm going to check for those empty fields. I need to make sure that both the date and the payment amount, H3 and H7, are not empty. If you saw that message box, let them know that to both add a payment date and the amount they're both required. I also want to make sure that the payment amount is equal to or less than the invoice balance. If for some reason they make a payment that's greater, I want to let them know. The payment amount above is the invoice balance. Are you sure you want to continue? And what does that mean? That means if we have a payment amount of, let's say, $100, and of course the invoice balance is just 88, right? I want to save that. I want to let the user know the payment amount is above the invoice. Are you sure you want to continue? And then if I say no, it's not going to continue. So we can use message box if H8 value is greater than 0. And what is H8? H8 becomes the balance, right? So the balance is simply the total invoice amount minus the total payments amount, previous payments, okay? So that's how we get it. And of course, that's going to leave a negative, and then we'll let the user know. Okay, great. So we've got that, and that's going to come in a message box, obviously 88. If we make it 0, then it would be just fine. Less as well. Okay, so what we're going to do is I need to determine then, is it a new payment or is it an existing? If it is a new payment, we know that there's no associated payment row. There's no ID and there's no payment row, not until we save it. So B3 is going to let us know if it's new or not. If B3 is empty, it's a new payment. We're going to determine the first available row for the payment, and it's going to be based on our payments database and the first available row. We're going to set that next payment ID. It's going to come from B4. We know that's calculated through the max formula, and that's going to go directly into B2. Then what I want to do is I want to set that brand new payment ID, set it into column A in our new payment row. And it's going to come from B4. That sets up. If it is an existing payment, all we need to do is extract the payment row from B3. That's going to set us up. Everything else in the next 5 columns, all we need to do is add in the information. Column B is going to take on the payment date. C is going to take on the customer name. Invoice is going to come into D. E is going to take on the amount, and F is going to take on the notes. Okay, great. I also want to know if it is paid, if it's fully paid. If this is 0, I also want to update the invoice paid status, right? Notice invoice number 6. I want to make sure that this goes to paid. And what is our paid? Our paid is right here inside our admin here. Let's pull that over here. Inside our admin is going to be this paid coming from C10. So I want to make sure that this goes in. And if we look at our invoice list and we see that I want to make sure that on invoice number 6 here, that the status goes from open to paid when it is paid in full, right? So we can do that in VBA. So what we're going to do is I'm going to check, is H8 of course is our invoice balance, is it 0 here? If we take a look inside our interpayments, I want to make sure that if this is now 0, H8, then we can go ahead and update that to the paid. So if 0, then D, invoice list, we know the invoice row, we've already extracted that, and equals C10, that is the fully paid. However, if it's not fully paid, we're going to set it to partially paid, which is C9, right? C9 from our admin is that way you can change it to this one. C9 is partially paid and C10 is fully paid, okay? So that's how we can set it. So then we go into the interpayments here and I decide I'm going to save that. We know, just like this, that it's going to automatically be set to fully paid. Now, when we go back into our invoice list, we see that it has now been fully paid. It's marked paid. Okay, very, very good. And of course, if we decide to make a change on that, what I like about this is the ability to go back. And if we go back and we decide that, no, they didn't pay in full, maybe they decided to pay less, and we save that payment once again, and then we go back inside the invoice list, we now see it's partially paid. So the status is automatically updated on the invoice. And so that's where that code comes in here. So we're just going to update the invoice paid status based on the amount that they've paid. Then what I want to do is I want to refresh the customer, that payment, that brand new payment information that we just saved. I want that to be also come into the list. So I want to make sure that our invoice list, we saw that on the payments, that automatically that updated payment amount got inside the payment history and it's all set there. If we decide to make a new payment also for invoice number 6 and we decide to pay the balance on that, we see now that the balance is $28. I want to then record that and then I want to save that and I want to have both of those come. So now we see that there's 2 payments been made on invoice number 6 and now the balance is 0. Okay, great. Now it can be a little bit tricky. We've got an invoice amount here, which is calculated based on the invoice row. So we know the invoice total, right? I've got a named range on our invoice list, and it's called invoice total. That is the total amount of the invoice. Formulas and then named range, we look in the invoice total. We see that we've got the total. It's going to be a dynamic named range based on that right here. And so that's going to be our named range. That will cover that. So what I want to do is I want to index that. I want to extract that invoice total based on the row that has been found right here inside the interpayments. So I want to know what row it's been found on. And we're going to wrap it on if error, indexing the invoice total based on B5 minus 2. Of course, why is that? Because our invoice total range starts on row 3. That starts on row 3. Therefore, but this is the actual row, right? There's a difference. So when I'm indexing, I need to subtract out 2. That's going to get us the actual total. And of course, it's column. That's going to extract that invoice amount. Now, the previous payments, now you'd think this, but this is a little bit trickier than you might think. And because what I need to do is I need to compensate for this payment. Notice that there's an existing payment here, right? We've saved this payment. There's 2 payments, right? If I change this to $20, I need to change the previous payment. Here's the tricky part, right? Pay attention here. Okay, I need this previous payments. Now, the previous payments are what? Are basically what we have to differentiate. So notice we have 2 payments here, 60 and 28. So total payments are 88, correct? But what if we change that? Notice our previous payments, if I simply sum both of those payments here, I'm going to get 88, right? But what if the user changes it? What if the user changes it to 20? I want this previous payments to be up to date and accurate based on the current payment amount. If I change this, I want the previous payments. Why? Because when we save that payment, automatically this gets we now have a 3 balance. So I want to make sure that the previous payments either incorporates all of the payments or not. So when we click a new payment, if I click 6 one more time, notice that this is updated. So here's what we need to do. I need to know, has this payment been saved before? If it's not, then all we need to do is simply add all the payments up. However, here's the previous one. If it has been saved before, what I want to do is I want to add in this amount, this 25 right here, not this one right here, not this 25. You see what I'm saying? So basically I want to sum all based only on invoice number 6, sum them all, but subtract the one that's found. And then I know it's kind of confusing, but it's very important. And then use this. That way they can make on the fly changes and it's automatically going to affect it. So that way, if they decide to pay it automatically, that balance is going to go to 0. So how do we do that? Well, first, what we need to do is we need to determine has it been saved or not. Okay. Here's if B3 is our payment row. If that's been saved already, right, that's not going to be empty. But if it's not, then all we need to do, it has not been saved yet, all we need to do is simply sum all of the payments based on that invoice number. So we're going to use the sum if. What are we going to sum? The range that we're going to check is based on the invoice numbers, based on whatever's in E3, and we're summing the payments amount. Very, very simple. But here's the other one. What if it has been saved? If it has been saved, I again want to sum all these up, but I want to subtract that specific one. What do I want to do? I want to subtract whatever is on payment number row 12, right? I want to subtract out this one. Subtract out this 25, subtracting it out, and then adding this one in. Do you see the difference, right? So we're summing it, we're subtracting out whatever's on row 12, and then adding this. So there's a differentiate, and we do that right through here. So we're going to do that. So again, we're summing everything out just as we did before. However, we're going to subtract out that 25. I need to find that 25. So we can use indirect or we can use index. So I'm going to use indirect based on column E and the interpayments B3 based on whatever's on row 12, right? I want to extract that. I want to subtract out that 25. I want to find that 25 using the indirect payments and the interpayments, that row right here. And of course, it is automatically going to be A1 style. So we're subtracting that out, right? We're subtracting out that 25. right here, but we're simply adding in whatever the user puts in H7, right? So that way, so if I go back without saving it, right, and I go back here, we see it's still 25 because I didn't save it, right? So now I made a mistake, right? So now I want to change it to 28. You'll see it's 25, but if I change it to 28, you'll see it's automatically updated. And that way the user can quickly see that changes that they make in the payment amount automatically affect the invoice balance, even if it's been previously saved. Very, very important, because that way we can differentiate between previously saved. And if we save that payment, now we have two payments that equals 28, and we can make changes. So it's extremely flexible when you add in this formula here that's going to allow us to do that. And then the invoice balance is simply the invoice amount minus the previous payments. So that's all we have to do, -6, because this previous payments, it's all key right here. This formula is super important. Again, just going to summarize it, differentiating between whether it's been saved or not. If it has not been saved, all we need to do is sum it up. If it has been saved already, we want to simply exclude that particular payment on the row, that particular payment, and then add in whatever the user has put in directly here. So that's it. Okay, I wanted to make sure that I went over that a little bit slower because it's a little bit tricky, but it is extremely important if you're running any kind of a payments. Super important when you take care of that. Great, so let's continue on with our code. So we understand that how we save it. So we're going to go back into the code here. Right where we left off, we're refreshing the customer payments, and then we're just going to run a fade out message. I don't even know. I didn't even see that message. Where'd it go? There it is, right up there. Payment saved. That's a fade out message. It's going to fade it out right up there on the top. And that's just going, it's a basic shape that we're fading out. We've been over that before. If not, you can download it. This is the code that's going to do that. It just runs a timer. Payment new, we've got a lot to cover here. We're just simply going to clear the contents out. The important thing is on payment new is especially to clear out B2. We especially need to make sure that the existing payment ID gets cleared out. We want that empty because that's going to trigger that payment row empty. So we've covered that, and then we're going to select the first available, which is that invoice number. Payment loading, again, we're going to clear all the contents out, but not clearing out B2. Making sure we're not clearing out B2 is very, very critical, right? B2 must stay in, okay? So we're going to clear that out. Whatever's in B2, we are going to, if B3 is empty, then please select the correct payment. So if I go previous, and I'll show you the code that we're going to run previous and next, we can see the previous payment that was made. So assuming that B3 is not empty, it does have a payment row, we can then load it in. All we're going to be doing is extracting that payment row from B3. And then just like we did, we're going to load all the associated data, date, customer, invoice, amount, and notes into the associated fields. We're not using data mapping because there's not enough fields really. There's only 5 fields, so it's not a big deal. Great. And then what I want to do is I want to load the previous customer payments, right? Once we load it, once we go, I want to load any previous payments based on that. So we're going to run the macro that loads that. That's all we have to do. Previous payments and next. Previous, I want to go to previous and next payments. Those are the two macros that are assigned to this button here and next payment. Now, if we get to the first payment and we're using it, we need to let the user know that we're at the first payment. You are already at the first payment created. How do we know? Well, we know because we're on the lowest number. Well, let's check that first. Previous payments right here. Payment ID is going to be based on B2. If the payment ID equals 0, there's no current ID. Why would that be? Well, if I'm on new payment, you see there's no. So what do we want to happen? There's no payment here. So we can't go previous. What do we want to happen? Well, what I would like to happen is I would like to go to the last one created. So the last one created, it would be payment ID number 10. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. If they click previous, that's what I want, payment ID 10. So how do we do that? Well, first of all, what we want to do is if B4, I want to check, is B4 equals 1, there's no previously saved payments. That means that there are no previously saved payments because B4 here, our next payment ID is 1. We know if it's 1, then there's no previous payments. We need to let the user know to please save any payments before navigating to previously saved. Great. So if it's not 1, then what we're going to do is we're simply going to set B2 to whatever's in B4 minus 1. B4 minus 1. That's all we have to do. However, we're just going to load the payments. So whatever's in B4 are current, set the payments one to the last one created. What was the last one created? Well, the last one created, right? We know that our next payment ID is 11. So the last one created is 10. All we need to do is take that 10, place it into B2, and then run the macro load. So that's all we're doing. B2 is simply the maximum number plus 1 minus 1, which will be the last one created. We're going to run the macro to load the payment and exit the sub. Very good. Well, what if the payment ID is 1? What if it is 1? Then we were already at the first payment created. However, if we're not at the first one and we're not at the last one, we're somewhere in the middle, then all we need to do is make B2, our payment ID, simply one less than whatever's currently there, and then run the macro to load. That's it. Next payment, very, very simple, except we want to make sure when we get to the last one, we want to let the user know that we're at the last one. You are already at the last payment. How do we know if it's the last payment? Well, we know that if B2 is simply equal to B4 minus 1, then we know that we're on the last payment. So the first thing what I'm going to do is I'm going to extract that payment ID into B2. If the payment ID is 0, then what do I want to happen? Then I want to go to the first available one, right? If it's 0, new payment, what do I want to happen when I go to next? Well, generally, I want to please select correct payment. So we don't need that. There's nothing there. So we want to make sure that we update that. I'm going to make that update right now. Okay, so if payment ID is 0, there's no current. So what do we want to happen? Well, what I want to do is there any current payments? So if there's not, I'm going to just set the payment to the last one. I'm going to set it to 1, right? B2 equals 1. I'm going to set it to the first one created. That's what I'd like to do for the first one. And then that will do it. So that's all we need to do. First one. I'm going to need to update that. Okay, but if there hasn't been any payments created, let the user know that please save a payment before navigating. We will know if B4 is 1. That is our next available ID. If it is 1, we know there are no payments saved. However, if it's 0 and it's not 1, then we know B2 is simply the first one. And so that change that I just made, when I click new payment and now I go next, I want it on the first one, right? So as I go, that way they can keep going next and previous, okay? So we set it to 1 if it's 0, okay? All right, if they get to the last one, if they get to the final one, which is here, then I want to say you're already on the last payment created. So how do we know that? Well, we can do that. If the payment ID equals B4 minus 1, which is the next available one minus 1, then we know we're at the last payment created. We're going to exit the sub. However, if we're somewhere in the middle, all we need to do is simply set B2 to whatever's in B2 plus 1, which is going to increment it up 1. It's going to set us the next payment ID. That is it. With payment delete, we have just a little bit, a very simple macro here. All we need to do here is to see, first give them a warning. Are you sure you want to delete this payment using message box? If they say no, we're going to exit the sub. Then focusing on the payment screen, if B3 is empty, we're going to go to not saved, right? If I decide I want to do a new payment and I want to enter some information here, and I decide I want to delete this payment, I want to, if I say yes, I just want it to clear out everything, right? It hasn't been saved before. We know it hasn't been saved because B3 is still empty. However, for an existing one, I want to make sure to delete the row associated with that. So if B3 is empty, we're going to skip that. Otherwise, we're going to set the payment row based on what is in B3. Then we're simply going to delete that row inside the payments database. And then lastly, we're going to run the macro that will clear everything out, which is payments new. All right, great. Well, that is all we need for the payments. Next up, we're going to run the dashboard macros. That's it. Inside the dashboard, we've got a lot of things going on. Well, first of all, we have this horizontal tab feature, so we're going to start with that. And then we're going to move on to the aging summary here, right in the middle here. How do we create this summary? Aging detail with this really cool option here. And then lastly, we'll go over the main dashboard. We've got kind of a roundabout of all the paid versus unpaid in aging summary, some top 5 customers by amount due and by sales. So we're going to go over all of that. All right, behind the scenes of that, it really starts out with our invoice list data, right? So we've got some terms here, we've got the total, and then we've got some information here. We've got total paid, the balance, and days overdue. Now, what I don't like to do is I don't like to have formulas when there's no data, right? So what I really like to do is keep my applications lean. So I only like to put in these formulas when they're needed. And that means I can simply remove them and then recreate them when all I need to do is refresh the dashboard or just go to an aging summary. It's going to automatically be refreshed. So how are we going to do that? Well, the first way to do that, as you see they're all back here, is to keep the formulas high up above, maybe in the first or second row, and then bring those formulas down only to the rows that we needed. See, we've only got here, 9 rows of data, so I only need 9 rows of formula. That keeps our workbook really light and safe. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to place these formulas up here, and then I'm going to have VBA bring them down only for the associated rows. Okay, so the first of it is I want to know the total amount they paid. Now, that's very, very important, and it's going to be based on an invoice. As you saw, we can have several payments per invoice. So we have named ranges that are going to help us with that. So let's just take a quick look at some of the named ranges and a few are going to be reminders. So we have our payments here. So we have the payment amount, which is the dynamic named range. We have the payment ID. We have the payment invoice number, which is critical. So we have those four that are going to help us determine the total number of payments on a per invoice basis. So along the lines of that, I want to be able to summarize that, and we can do that directly inside the invoice list. So to get that sum on a per invoice basis of how many payments were made per invoices, all we need to use is the sum if. And the range that we're going to do is going to be based on that invoice number. So we're going to do the payments based on the invoice number based on A3, which is our first row of data. And then what I'm doing is I'm summing the payment amounts. So that means when I bring this down for any particular row, it's going to be based on that row. And so that's very, very easily how we get the payments, total number of payments. There have not been any payments for invoice number 1. I also want to know the balance. Well, the balance is very simple. Once we know the total paid and I know the total invoice, then I simply know the balance. So the balance is just simply the total invoice minus the total paid. G3, we're always going to use our first row of data. Notice it's 3, always that first row of data. And I also want to know how many days are overdue, right? So that's very, very important. So I'm going to check if H3 is less than G3, meaning our total paid is less than the total balance. If our total paid is less, then I also want to know how many days overdue. We notice our due date is on December 16th of 2021. Well, that's 113 days from the current date, right? Previously, so we know this invoice is 113 days late. We can use this H3, then all we're going to do is take the current date minus F3, minus that due date, the current date minus the due date. If it's a negative number, we know it is not yet currently due. Okay, and if it's the same day, we know that it's currently due on any other day. And however, if it's empty, of course, we know that it's already been paid, right? If otherwise, we're just going to show empty because we know it's been paid already. There's no balance there. Okay, great. So having that information and bring it down, the first thing what I want to do is anytime I want to run our data, I want to make sure that these formulas are brought down. So that's the first thing we're going to do. So if we take a look inside the dashboard module, we're going to determine the last row, the last results row, the selected row, and the column and the detail number. Those are going to help us as long variables. So the first macro is the tab change, right? Might as well go in order. How do we do that? Well, when we tab change, notice when we make a selection change on those tabs in the tab, whether we're selecting on B2, C2, or E2, we're going to make those changes. So that's going to be based on the selection change. So why don't we start with that right away and go into that. So that's very simple, based on the selection change. If the user makes a tab selection change between B2 and E2 is nothing, then what do I want to do? Well, the first thing what I want to do is I want to trigger some conditional formatting. As you can see, there's some conditional formatting that's triggered, right? We don't use VBA. Conditional formatting will let us know, give it that look. So the first thing what I want to do is make sure that each one has a color, the same color. So if I right click here and then I format those cells, we can see that each cell has a fill effect. Right? This fill effect already has, so they all have the same fill effects. This is for all those associated cells. So, and they also contain borders, right? We see that they all have borders around them. However, when the conditional formatting is triggered based on the column selected, we also see that there's a missing border and the color is lighter, right? There's a missing lower border. And that's all going to be based on the selected column. And we're going to store our selected column right over here inside AA3. So that means when I select either one of those B2, C2, or E2, I want that column to appear directly inside AA3. So we can do that with this code. Here, AA3 equals the target column, okay? This will trigger the conditional formatting. And what we'll do is we're going to take a look inside that conditional formatting, highlighting those things here, going into the home, and then conditional formatting and managing those rules. We see that we have some conditional formatting based on what is in AA3. If we edit that rule, we see that we have some, I want to blend the bottom part of those fill effects with the same as the background color. That bottom part is going to be based on the same as the background color. Also, what I want to do is I want to remove that bottom border. I want to clear out that bottom border. That's very important. Once I do that, whatever column is associated with that it's going to be applied to B2 through F2. Okay, and I also want it bolded. Okay, so that's how we're going to do it. So automatically do that. Okay, continuing on with our code, dashboard tab. Then we're going to run the macro dashboard tab change. So if we go into dashboard, that is the macro that we're going to run next. So that's the one. First thing we're going to do is turn off application screen updating. Okay, next up, what I want to do is focus directly on the dashboard. We want to know that selected column. I want to put that into a variable, and that variable is going to be inside AA3. And all I want to do first thing is when we hide shapes, I want to hide everything. So I've got all of this dashboard grouped into a single name called dashboard group, right? So I want to make sure to hide this, and I want to hide all the rows. So basically what I'm going to be doing is I'm hiding associated rows. So if we unhide this, we see that we've got rows here from 33 through all the way down, and then we have way down here at row 500, or yeah, somewhere about up right there. So I've got additional data here located at 5. So I've given a lot of space for this information. So what I want to do is I want to hide all the rows, and I want to hide all the shapes. I also have some shapes associated with this. These two, this text box and this drop-down list, are grouped together, and it's called, the group itself is called detail group. So I want to hide both the detail group and I want to hide the dashboard group, both of those, and I want to hide all the associated rows. So anytime you have tab, the first thing you want to do is always to hide everything. So hide all shapes, and nice spelling, Randy. So I hide all shapes and graphs. So for the rows from 4 to 1004, we're going to hide all those rows. Entire row hidden equals true. Then those two shapes that I mentioned, we're going to hide those. Now what we're going to be doing is we're going to use the select case to determine what do we want to do based on whatever tab was selected. And so select case is going to help us with that. So we're going to be basing it, of course, on that selected column. If we know the case is 2, the second column, we know it's a dashboard. If it's 3, we're going to run that aging summary. And if it's 5, we're going to run the aging detail. So for the dashboard, all we need to do is then unhide the associated rows, 4 through 32. And then all we need to do is simply display the shapes that are associated with that dashboard group. So we just need to simply display it. And then I'm going to run a macro called dashboard refresh. And basically that's going to refresh all the data that's associated with that dashboard. However, if it's 3, meaning the aging summary, all we're going to be doing is unhiding those rows associated, 33 through 502. And we're going to be running the macro that's going to refresh that aging. If it's 5, all we need to do then is, again, unhide the associated rows with that, 503 to 1004. And then also what we're going to do is unhide the shape group associated with that, the detail group. And then lastly, we're going to run the macro that's associated with that, which is aging detail refresh. That's going to run it. Okay, and then I just want to select another cell. I don't want to keep the selection inside that. So I'm going to select A1, which is just a cell that's going to allow us to make the same selection again if they want to. It's much easier than that. It doesn't keep the selection on that. I don't really want to keep the selection on the tab. So that's all we need to do to run that selection. Relatively simple on that. And then of course, turn on screen updating. Okay, the first of which, let's go over with the dashboard refresh, right? The dashboard refresh, I've got all these tables here that are going to help us with that, and these graphs and charts that are going to help us refresh the table. But what I want to make sure of is I want to make sure that the data is refreshed. And we take a look inside this, we do want to run a macro because we know that this data here, but these are all going to be done by VBA. Remember, I want to be able to delete these, clear them out, and I don't want to extend those formulas beyond what we have. This is very helpful. We're only having formulas where. So what do I need to do? I need to determine the last row, and then I need to take these formulas and bring them down. And we can do that with just that macro that's going to do it. And remember, on the tab, it's going to run. When we tab, it's going to run that macro. And we see inside the invoice list that the data has all been updated. Okay, so how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to run this macro. First of all, called data refresh. That's going to refresh all the data. Our data is located on the invoice list. So that's the first one we want to go. We're going to clear the prior results. So if we take a look inside this invoice list and we take a look, we've got some data that we're going to bring. I want to know for this data some additional information, right? I want to know the customer invoice details. I've got a lot of information here that's going to help us. Here we want to know the unique unpaid, right? So we want to know the unique customers here for another report. This we'll go over in just a moment. And I want to do that. I also want to clear out some information here. If the customer's invoice details, if there's any customer invoice details, I want to clear them out. So we're going to do that AB through AJ, clearing out all the details. I'm going to determine the last row of those invoices. And then what I'm going to do is once I determine that last row, I'm going to bring down those formulas just as I mentioned to you, starting all the way from H3 all the way down to the last row. We're going to copy those formulas from H1 through J1. And we do that with just a single line of code. We don't need to use copy and paste, but we do need to use the dot formula. So H3 through J in the last row is simply equal to H1 through J1 dot formula. Bring down total, pay days, and overdue formula. All right, next up, what I want to do is I want to run that advanced filter based on that. And what's the criteria? The criteria is going to be based on L1 through L2, right? I want to know everything that's not paid. I want to know what is everything other than what's paid, right? That's going to help us out. That's going to get us our information. So we're going to run that criteria, everything that's not paid, and then we're going to have those results into P2. That's going to get us a unique list of all the customers who are not paid, right? Customers who have open balances, right? Everything that's not paid, statuses. So that's going to get us just a unique customer. Those unique customers are going to come here. That's all. We don't have any of this data here. It doesn't exist yet, right? But what I want to do is determine how many customers, and then again, take formulas here and bring them down to get us all of that information here, because this keeps your workbook very light when we don't have formulas unless we actually need them. Calculation on demand. So what I want to do then is get the last row and then bring down those formulas. I want to know the current balances. So how do we know that? Well, let's take a look inside these formulas. We're going to use the sum ifs because it's going to be based on multiple conditions. I want to know the invoice balance, right? We have that. We've just created that dynamic name range called the invoice balance here. I want to know the balance based on all the payments and the invoice total. So, but here, this invoice balance is going to be based on a few conditions. The first of which is going to be based on the customer name located in P3. The second one is I want to base it on the named range. Days over must be less than 1, right? Days over must be less than 1. Current is only the days over. We see our days over we have a days overdue here. This is a named range. Going into the formulas, name manager, and we see invoice here, and we scroll down and we see days over. And of course, that is all of the days overdue. So we're only looking for those that are not paid yet and yet are less than 1. 0 days or negative is fine too. Okay, so that's what I want to have here. However, what about if it's going to be 1 through 30 days overdue? 1 through 30 days overdue. We're going to again use the sum if. We're also summing the invoice balance. We're also doing the customers. But this time what I want to do is going to be days over. 1 through 30 we're focused on now. So there's going to be 2 conditions here. Same, we're summing the invoice balance. We're also basing it on a single customer here. And this time it's going to be 2 conditions because I want the days over must be greater than 0, and the days over must be less than 31. That is going to give it to us. Same thing for 31 through 60, except we're changing the days over greater than 30 and the days over for less than 61. For 61 through 90, we're simply looking for the days over which is greater than 60 and less than 91. Anything older that is simply everything greater than 90. Everything greater than 90, and of course, it's all we have those data. So I want to know all of the data where the days over is currently 90, right? That's very important. So I want to know that. And then, of course, the total balance, right? I want to know the total balance. What is the total? Simply the sum of everything. And then I also want to know the total invoice for a customer, and that's going to be based on P3 and the invoice total. So this is simply the total that's been invoiced. Then I'm going to take those, determine the last row, and then bring down those formulas here. So that's exactly what we're going to do inside the macro. So let's take a look inside this macro here. So we're bringing down, so once we have the last results row, and then all we need to do is bring down the formulas. Again, Q3 through W in the last results row, formula equals Q1. So when I run this macro, we're going to see that all of those formulas are brought down. Now I have a perfect grid for everything. So we have the customers here, bringing them down. We have all the data here that's been brought down. So we know all the customers with current balances, and we know the number of days. So we can see that Dolores, she has one invoice that's for $2 that's between 61 and 90. She's got one that's over 500. She's got a total balance of 2. Whoops, messed that up. That should be, no. One more column. There we go. That's the one I want. Okay, so let's refresh that again. Got one more column. There we go. There we go. Okay, now we got it correct. So now, right, so we want to make sure that it's all the way from Q all the way to U, right, including the older ones. So now we've got the total balance right here, and we've got the total numbers. Now we know that she's been invoiced 764. 502 of that is her balance, right, Dolores. So that we're just going to bring it all the way over there. Okay, great. So we've got that covered. We understand that. We understand how just a little bit of code can give us this. So now we've got some really good information that's going to help us. And we see that we've got a table called Aging Summary. This table is going to help us create it. We've got a table called Aging Summary. This is a summary of all the aging. So we can use that to create our graphs. Okay, let's continue on in order. So now what we have is our dashboard select aging details. Now this is a cool feature that I show you. What I want to do is I want to create this. When I select the current balance, I want to click here and I want to know the current balance. If I click here, I want to know the 31. So we're going to get into that. But before we do, let's take a quick look and see how we created these. First of all, how did we create these? Well, we know, I also want to know the total overdue and the total due. That's very important numbers. So based on the data that we just created using those formulas, inside the invoice list, I'm also able to create some information here. So if we can take a look in here, we know the total due is going to be simply on the total balances on column I. So that's our total due. And we're going to give that a name called total due. And I've got the total overdue, right? That's important. I want to know the total. How much is overdue of that total due, of the total due? How much is actually overdue? Well, that's going to be based on the days overdue. So we're going to use the sum ifs. And we're summing ifs the invoice balance, right? So that's what I want to know. I want to know the invoice balance, but I only want to know that if the invoice balance is greater than 0, and I also want to know the due date, invoice due date is less than or equal to day, less than or equal to day. That is going to let us know that of the total due, we know that 1,200 of the 1,400 is overdue. So once we have those, we can then put that inside our dashboard. We can do that with just some very easily. I've just built some shapes here. And then we have our shape, text box shape, that's simply linked to the total overdue. And we also have our total due here is simply linked to the total due. So those are two named ranges that I created for a single cell, both on total overdue and total due. So that's how we get that relatively easy. And now what I want to know is I want to know the total paid versus the outstanding, right? So if we see here, I've created a pivot chart, and we take a look inside the pivot chart and we'll look inside the pivot data, and it's going to be based on this. So we have the total, here's our pivot data sheet. We have our values, we have our total paid versus invoice. So where is that going to come from? Well, if we take a look inside our pivot table and we analyze it, we see it's called the total paid invoices, right? And we take a look inside this, and we understand it's going to come from some information on pivot table 1, okay? So what I want to know is, where does this data come from? Where does the total paid versus balance come from? Well, it comes from, of course, our pivot table. So we're going to look back inside our invoice list, and we see we've created a table here, and it's going to be called our invoice data. So it's all going to come from our invoice data. And so we created a pivot table based on our invoice data. And what is the information inside? Well, I really want to know, the total paid, and I want to know our total balance. So we've created some information here. We've got pivot table 1. So let's just give it a pivot table 1. And also what I want to do is I want to track just that information here. So when we show the field list, we see that all we're tracking is the total paid and the balance. And those are the values that I want to sum here. That's it. I just want to search by values. So rows are going to be the values. So all I want to do is sum the total paid and the balance. And that gives us our pivot table. It's very simple. And then I just created a very basic pie chart based on that. And then also just a little bit of a timeline so we can learn by years. If we want to know the years that are associated, we can create a little timeline based on this. And it's very simple to do that once you have your data here. If you want to then, you see the pivot table analyze, you can create timelines by inserting a timeline on that. And it's going to be based, you can base it on either the date or the due date, right? Any date will do function, and you have a little timeline here. And then we just customize that. We can customize, we've got a custom chart here, and this one here is without backgrounds, and you can remove some information. So we can customize this, right? simply using the modify. And then of course we can remove the timeline simply by formatting it. We can remove the fill if it's no fill and no border if we want to. So that's just a custom timeline and we've removed all the features. Great, so that's how we created that. And that's how we create our total paid versus outstanding balances. I also want to know an aging summary, right? If we take a look inside our aging summary, I want to know the current balance, 1 through 30 days. So we've got additional data inside our aging summary. And that's also going to come from pivot table. And this is here, it's called our Invoice Aging Balance Summary. So this is also some pivot table field. And this pivot table data is going to be based directly on the data from our results in our invoice list. So it's going to be directly based on this. If we take a look at this, we see that that's going to be aging summary. This table name is called aging summary. And our pivot table data is extracted directly from here. So back inside our pivot table, we see in our show field list that it's coming directly from here. And what we want in the values is simply all of the current 31 through 60, 60, and 90, and bringing that into the values. And we simply want to display those by the rows, right? Those values by the rows. So we're going to get all these values in here, and then the totals in the summary here. And then all we need to do is just simply create a brand new chart based on that. So we have a chart, here's a chart, right, based on that. So we created a chart based on that pivot table. And here's the chart that you can see. And all I did is just format it. Now what I want to do is I want to create some drill down capabilities so that if I want to know what all of the invoices that make up the current balance, I want to just simply click it and have that ability to come to the aging detail. So how did we do that? Well, of course, that comes on aging detail. So first what we do is we have a drop down list of options. All 5 of those options are going to come right here. And you can see here, we have all these options located right here. So we've created an aging option list, a name range aging option. And we've got some numbers to go along that. So what I want to do is I want to know based on the number of days overdue. So for example, our current balances is going to be anywhere from -9999, right, all the way to 0. So anything basically under 0 is going to be a current balance. That would be days overdue. So we're going to set that up. 1 through 30 is going to have anywhere from 1 through 30 days overdue, 31 through 60, 61 through 90, and then older would be 91 through 99. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another advanced filter with these 2 criteria from this to this. And that criteria is going to be located inside our invoice list once again. So if we look all the way over on the right, we have days overdue. We have 2 columns because it's going to be and or. So for example, if I go back into the dashboard and I make a change and I say I only want to show those invoices with 31 through 60. So we see we only have 1 result. And if we come back into the invoice list and we see our criteria has changed from 31 through 60. And we can use, of course, a formula to extract those days. And inside that, what we can see is we have the greater than or equal, and we're going to index based on the dashboard. We're going to index it, and it's going to be based on the selection change. So let's take a little bit deeper look into that and see how we arrange that. So inside that dashboard, what we have is we have a drop-down list here. And this drop-down list is connected in 2 parts. So what we'll see is we have, of course, the foundational. Let's select that. The foundational part inside the format control. And we see that is the input range as the aging option. And we also have a cell link, and our cell link is going to be that selected option. So it's AA504. That is the cell that it's connected to. So we notice that the selected option is our 3rd option. If we change it to 1 through 30, we're going to see that that is the 2nd option. So I know that I've got the 2nd option, and I know this is my 2nd option here. So what I need to do is I need to run an index. I need to know the AA and the 2nd option is going to be here, and the all the way to is going to be 30. So what I need to do is determine if I know it's the 2nd one, I need to look on our 2nd option here, and I want to extract the 1, and I want to extract the 30, and I want to put those into the criteria. So we can see that's just what I've done here. So we're going to use the index, and we're dashboarding. This is our from. Our from is AA506 to AA510. And what number are we going to use? What is the row number? The row number is going to be based on the selected items, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. or 5. So that's it. And then of course we're going to have the column. So our row numbers based on 504. Again, our row numbers based right here on 504. So that's going to get us the second row in our index. That's how we can extract it. Now, of course, the 2 is simply going to be AB, column AB. So when we go inside our invoice list here and we look here, now what we're doing is we're indexing column AB 506 through AB 510. We're using the same row based on 504, and we're using that single column. So when we combine that with less than or equal to and greater than, we now have our dynamic criteria. So now all we need to do is run our advanced filter based on the days overdue, and then have our criteria come in here. And then what I want to do is I want to have the results come right into here. Once the results of that come in, we can then bring those results directly inside our dashboard right here. Well, that is with the aging macro. So it's the same macro that we're running from this as the same macro that we're running from this, right? So it's the same macro. So for example, if I click current balance, we see that the current balance is here. It is the same macro if I select 31 through 60 days, and it's the same macro if I select this, 31 through 60, and the same macro if I select older. So basically it's the same macro running. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna cover both the macro that runs this and the macro runs this as it's the same macro. So what macro is that? Well, the first thing what we want to do is we want to understand that we have to differentiate. So what I did is I put a bunch of shapes here. Over each one of these is a shape, and there's a macro that's assigned to each of those shapes. But there's slightly difference in the name. So this is called aging 1. This shape is called aging 2, this shape called aging 3, and so on and so forth. So there's a differentiator between that 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, right? So it is the same exact numbers, of course, that correspond to here. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, okay? So we know that those numbers, so if we extract those numbers out of those shape names when they're clicked, we know which one. If it's 1, it's going to be current balance. If it's 3, 31 through 60 days, right? So we know that. Knowing that, all we need to do is simply then, if we click on this, we need to extract the 1 from the word aging. We just need to remove the word aging and left remaining 1. And that's exactly what we do with the macro. So if we click on the assign macro, we see that it's been a macro called dashboard select aging detail. When we edit that, we see that we have right here, the next macro here is called dashboard select aging details. And again, all we need to do is take the shape name, it's also called application color, and remove the word aging from it. When we do that, replacing it with nothing, it leaves us with the detail number. If we know that detail number, we're going to place that detail number directly in AA504. That's what we're going to do. And then all we need to do is simply run the macro, right? Then it's dashboard E2 select. When we select E2, it automatically runs that macro, right? That macro is automatically running as we select E2. Just as a refresher, when we go into the dashboard right here and we select on E2, right, the dashboard, right, the selection change, we see that we are going to run the dashboard tab change, right? It is that tab change that we're also running that's going to actually select that one at the top of this, right? If it's the last one, aging detail, right? It is the aging detail refresh macro that we're running. We're running the macro that refreshes that every time we select. And that is the macro that we're going to run. So that is the macro that I'm going to go over with you. So if we scroll down here inside our dashboard and we look down here under dashboard aging refresh here, right here, dashboard aging details, sorry here, aging details, all we have to do, this is the select one, this is the one that we just ran, here's the one. So we're simply going to refresh that. And what is that one? It's called aging detail refresh. That's the one we need to do. All we need to do is, of course, clear out the current list, right? And here in aging detail, all we need to do is just clear out the current list from B all the way through J, clearing anything that would be any other older data. And then what we need to do is focus on the invoice list. On the invoice list, again, we're going to focus on clearing out the data. We have our customer invoice details here. So we're going to clear out any existing data, A, B through C, right? So A, B, 3 through AJ, all the way, clearing the contents, Going to get the last row. We're going to run an advanced filter, but we're going to bring down the formulas just as we did before. I want all of that information. I want to bring down those formulas just in case there's been any changes here. Once we have that, we can then run our advanced filter. But this time the criteria is going to be AL1 through AM2. If we scroll over here, we see that this is our criteria here, AL1 through AM2. So our criteria is based on the days overdue. Our results are going to come directly in here, AB through AJ. Here's our results, AB through AJ. Then all we need to do is determine the last row of the results and simply bring those results directly into our dashboard here. That's it with the last line of code. Very, very simple. So we covered both the aging detail on this, the selection change, and we covered this because they're both related. And it is the same exact macro that when we change this we assign macro, we see that is the aging detail refresh. It is that same macro that's assigned to that drop-down list so that it automatically refreshes on a change. Okay, great. So next up, we have the top 5 customers. So we covered the aging summary and the aging detail here. And what we want to do is we want to know the top 5 customer sales, right? How do we know that? Well, again, back in our pivot data, we now have the same information, but we have top 5 customers by invoice amount. So if we right click on here and we look in the pivot table options, we see that we've got a lot of options. It's based on the pivot table name 6, pivot table name 6. That's the one we're going to work with, okay? So we're going to basically take this and we have a filter set up. What kind of filters are set up? Well, I want the top 5, right? So if I select here on the top 10, we see that we've got the top 5 items, the sum of the total invoice. I want the top 5 here. And I also want it sorted by values, right? Sum, and this sorted. Here's a sorted by largest to small. So I want the largest, smallest. And then of course, when we do that, we need to make sure that we, of course, make sure that it is formatted for currency. So then we have the top 5. So all I need to do is simply convert that, add basically any type of a pivot table analysis we can see. So we've got a lot of options here, but what we want to do basically is create a chart. So all we need to do is just insert, and of course I just inserted a basic column, a bar chart here. So when we do that, I just chose column, and that's pretty much it. And then what I've done is just move it over, right? You can just move the chart over, and once it's moved over, I just customized it a little bit so that we can clearly see the data in here. So back into the dashboard, here's our chart. So this was the sales, this is the amount due. So let's just go back over that. Amount due, right? Total amount invoiced, total balance here, total balance, what is that on the account? So we've got that, and again, just like I did before, the value filters, we're focused on the top 5 items by value. So we have the total balance on this one, and then the total invoiced, okay? And we can choose. So total, this is the same thing as sales or sales invoice. We can put invoice to make it a little clearer. Sales invoiced. And this is by amount due or balance due. Okay. All right, so we've got that covered. Very, very simple on these, not much. Lastly, I want to focus on the aging summary. The aging summary is exactly what we've just done. Pretty much all that we have left on that is the aging summary, and that's up here. So if we take a look inside, right, this one here, the aging refresh right here, that's the one we're going to focus on here. Of course, we're going to first clear out anything from I4. Actually, this should be I35, I think 35. Let's update that and take a quick look, right? I want to update I35, right? Or B35, let's put that on the dashboard. B35 through I and all the way around. So that's definitely going to be as we add more to that. So I'll show you that because we've got some really cool things. Not only in I, I'm going to set that up to B, but everything in between, including from B all the way over to R, right? All the way over to R, because we also have that. Let's update that to B35 all the way to Q, and Q is fine. So B, so not only are we going to be able to show the actual total summary, do I want to know how, for example, this one, Dolores, right? She's got one that's 6190 and one that's older. So that's got 2 different invoices. So I want to select the detail. Not only do I want to show the total summary for each customer, but I want to show the individual resources on selection change. Okay, so to do that, all we need to do is just bring in the information. So let's take a quick look here. So first we're going to clear out all the information. We're going to run our advanced filter from our invoice list. There it is, B35. I want to make sure I update that. And then the invoice list, I want to clear out any of the details. Clearing out the contents from AB3 through AJ. That is on our invoice list. Clearing out all of the details here. Invoice list, okay? AB, I want to clear out all these customer details here, clearing out everything, including this here, all the way through P. And then what I want to do is I want to get those unique customers. So how are we going to do that? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to run our advanced filter. Again, I want the criteria to be H1 through J1. What is that criteria? Let's take a quick look at that. Those formulas are focused here. We're going to bring down those formulas, H1, bring in all those formulas. Then our criteria comes in. Here's our criteria right here. L1 through L2. Our criteria is right here, L1 through L2. Bring in that. Our criteria is anything that is not paid, right? Anything that is not paid, that's what I want to know. I want to know all open balances, right? But what do I want? I want to get my customers. I want to know all the customers with open balances not paid. Here's our criteria. Here's our results here. So our results are going to come here. P2 is our customers. So I want to know a unique list of those customers. So here's our results here. Once we determine the last row of our customers, then what I want to do is I want to determine the formulas that we know over. I want to determine where those balances fall as far as current or how many days overdue. I want to know that. So we're bringing down all of these formulas. Here's the line where we bring in all of those formulas. Q1 through W1 is going to be here, bring in all those values. And then what we're going to do is just simply bring them over into the dashboard starting on B35 through H. That is going to bring all the variables here. Bring them right here, B35 all the way through H and down, right? So it starts off in row 35. This one starts off in row 3, so we need to compensate for the difference by adding 32. Okay, that is great. So that's how we get our mean, but how do we, when we make a selection change, how do we get these invoice details here? Well, of course, that's going to come on selection change when we make a selection change from B35 to H. So let's go back into the dashboard and take a look at that selection change. And here we have this selection change here. So if we make a selection change from B35 and we know that B contains a value, right? It has to have a value in column B, then I want something to happen. Well, the first thing what I want to do is I want to put that target row in AA1. What that's going to do is trigger the conditional formatting. I've got that target row. We've got conditional formatting. It's going to select to show that selected row, 35 currently. So it's going to show that. It's going to change to 36 or 37. So that's the first thing I do. The next thing what I want to do is run a macro called show customer detail. I want to know, basically what I want to know is all the invoices that are open for this specific customer. And again, we're going to use another advanced filter. So let's take a look inside the invoice list, and we see here that we have a customer. Now we can change our, here's our criteria here. Status, of course, does not equal paid, and the customer. So what I want to do is I want to pull that customer in. How are we going to get that? Well, it's going to be based on, I'm going to use an index, column B1 through B1000, and we're going to use the dashboard AA1. We know that the selected row is right here, 35. So if we index column B, and we know that row 35 contains the lowest richness, so index will take care of that. It'll put that name directly as our criteria inside our pivot list here. Then all we need to do is run our advanced filter, and I want to determine all the invoices for this customer that are not paid, and I want those invoices to be listed right here. So that's just what we're going to do right now. So once we run this macro, it's going to do all that for aging, show customer detail. So we go back into that, and we look down here, aging, show customer detail. First thing we're going to do is clear any results on our previous results on our dashboard. So I want to clear any previous results. I'm going to fix that up. Should be J, let's put J33 all the way through R and down. Okay, so I'm going to update that. J33, we'll go with 34. That should be sufficient. All the way down. Okay, so we're clearing the previous row. I also want to determine the selected row. That's very important, and that's going to be in AA1, as we mentioned. We're going to focus on that invoice list. We're going to clear any results from the invoice list all the way from AB3, clearing all those results because I want to put brand new results in, and I want to run that. So starting with all the way with AB3 and all the way down, we're going to clear out those results. Then what I would like to do is I want to make sure that we set the last row and running another advanced filter, but bringing down the formulas just as we did, bringing all those formulas, running our advanced filter, but this time our criteria is Y1 through Z2 here. Status and customer right up here, Y1 through Z2. Bringing our results all the way from AB through AJ. Very simple here. then determining the last row, and then we're just simply going to bring in all the data, actually starting with AB1 all the way down to the last, right? So I want to bring in everything this time, AB1, including the headers, including the top, and I'm going to bring them into J and the selected row, and R in the selected row plus the last row minus 1, because I want it relative. I want to place it relative. So when I select on here, I want the top rows to be the same. So if I select Frank, I want that top row to be relative and bringing it down here. So that's great. So, but what about now we know how we're going to get it. That's it for that macro. But what about if I select on something and I want to go to an invoice? I want to go to a specific invoice. If I make a selection change anywhere from J, and I want to make sure it's a whole number. If I select here, I don't want anything to happen on invoice ID. I only want something to select if I select on a row where J contains a numeric value. I want to show this little icon and I want to be able to click it and I want to be able to load that specified invoice. So how are we going to do that? Well, the first is going to come on selection change, right? There's going to be a selection change event. So let's go back in to the code on the dashboard and look for the selection change event, right? So we on intersection, here we go, J37 through R, and J must contain, right, a value, has to contain a value, can't be blank. And one other thing, I also want to make sure that J is a numeric value, right? Because if we look here, J contains text, I don't want anything to happen, but only on a numeric value, where 4 or 7 is a numeric value. So we're going to check to make sure J is numeric, right, is a whole number. And we can do that through here. Is numeric, right? J and the target row is numeric here. If it equals true, then continue on. What do I want to do? I want to put that selected row. What row are we selected? I'm going to trigger conditional formatting. I'm going to put that selected row directly in AA2 right here. Okay. Once we've then selected it, I also want to show this icon. That particular icon is called View Invoice Button. So on that button right there, I want to place it. So first of all, shapes, View Invoice Button. We're going to set the left position based on column S. We're going to set the top position based on column S and the target row, and then we're going to make sure it's displayed. Okay, that's all we're going to do. Otherwise, we're just clearing A2. When we select anything else, we're clearing A2 when only we select it. Okay. All right. So we know how we select it. Now all we need to do is just simply tie a macro to this button, and we have that macro. We know the selected row, right? Those selected rows based on in AA. We also know the invoice number because it's in column J. So if I take that and I put it directly inside, I go to the invoice screen and I put in 7 here, it's automatically going to trigger that to load. So all I need to do is put it in L1. And that's exactly what we do inside the View Invoice. So going back into the dashboard, the last macro that we have to go over is the Aging Go to Invoice. It is this macro that is assigned to that icon. So we're going to set that selected row based on AA2, and we're going to make sure it's not 0. And then what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that J in the selected row is not empty. We want to make sure that has a whole number. And then we're going to activate the invoice screen. And then inside the invoice L1, we're going to place whatever's in J in the selected row. That is going to place that invoice number directly inside. And of course, we're going to be able to load whatever invoice just based on that. Very, very cool. All right, we've shown you how we can create this incredible dashboard, right, with both paid versus outstanding, an aging summary with a single click, drill down into that, really cool. Top 5 customers and sales invoices, an aging summary to show on a summary along with a drill down of the individual invoices and a go-to invoices, aging detail. Of course, we had a really cool interpayment screen, tons of flexibility with that, allowing us to show how we created this really tricky but very, very cool previous payment summary that's always going to be accurate, and some changes with the invoice. All right, thank you so much for joining me on this incredible training on our accounts receivable. We've gone over that. We'll probably do accounts payable very soon. This covers the accounts receivable and how you can create a really incredible accounts receivable right in Excel. All right, thanks so much. Don't forget to click like on the video. Go ahead and comment below. I answer every comment. Subscribe, and also 200 of my best templates in one zip file. I hope you picked that up. I'll include the links down below for that. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next week.